Hi everyone, welcome to the Mental Health Coordinating Council's webinar on recovery coaches, which is the new support item that was recently introduced by the NDIA. My name's Carmel Tebbit, I'm the CEO of the Mental Health Coordinating Council and your host today. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're standing on. For me, that is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, but it will be different because we're being joined by participants right across Australia. I also want to acknowledge people with a lived experience of mental health conditions, their families and carers, including those who are with us today, and recognise the many contributions to the community and mental health service sector. As we know, the NDIA recently announced the introduction of the Psychosocial Recovery Coach support item. It was one of a range of improvements to the NDIS for participants with a psychosocial disability. There's been a lot of interest in recovery coaches since the item was announced. We've had a huge response to our webinar today with over 400 people registering to attend. And we're very fortunate to have a panel of experts from the NDIA to discuss recovery coaches, and we'll hear from them shortly. Just to run through, after we hear from our panel, we'll have an opportunity for questions. There's been a number of questions that were submitted by people when they registered, so I will be putting those questions to the panel. But there's also an opportunity for you to ask questions by clicking on the blue hand icon, which should be in the top right-hand side of your screen. So I'll be keeping an eye on those questions as well, and if we get a chance, we'll be asking our panelists to respond to those questions. So I'm now going to introduce our three panelists. We'll be hearing from Dr. Jerry Norton, who is the Strategic Advisor on Mental Health and Psychosocial Disability for the NDIA. And Jerry has had extensive experience in the community mental health sector. He was the CEO of Mind Australia before he took up his position with the NDIA, and a member of the Independent Advisory Council, and along with Janet Ma and others, led the IAC's work on mental health and the NDIS. Jerry's also currently chair of the National Mental Health Sector Reference Group and a member of the Expert Advisory Committee for the Royal Commission into Victoria's mental health system. So welcome to Jerry. Jerry will be joined on the panel by Arundathi Jayakody, who's the Assistant Director Mental Health for the NDIA. And Arundathi has a lived experience of mental ill health and recovery, and her work is informed by her lived experience. And Arundathi brings a consumer perspective to the work of the team. So welcome, Arundathi. And then our third panelist is Melitha Pereira. And Melitha is an occupational therapist who has worked in the mental health sector in various settings, including clinical services and community services. And over the last 4 years, Melitha has supported people with a psychosocial disability and their families to navigate the NDIS. So welcome, Melitha. So that's enough from me at the moment. I'm going to hand over to you, Jerry. Thanks very much for joining us today.
Thanks, Carmel. Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here with you this afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us. To hear that we have over 400 people registered for this webinar is just fantastic. We've been doing webinars on the psychosocial recovery coach across the country, and it's great to hear the sort of reaction we're getting to this concept. My colleagues who will be presenting with me today and I have played a strong role in helping to frame the details of this role. And it's a bit like, I suppose, the analogy I have is the birth of a new baby. So, great expectation, wonder what's going to happen, and then there's the reality of this new role to deal with. And I think as we're wanting to do today, we're wanting to outline to what's the nature of this role, why it's come about, what we're seeing, some of the issues involved in implementation, and then to open up for questions about what are the issues you're wanting further information on. So just to say, to set some context for this, as we all know, recovery-orientated practice is an important element of mental health practice. But this concept was not included in the initial design of the NDIS. So the introduction of the psychosocial recovery coach was the first of a number of initiatives which will build recovery practice back into the scheme. And we think that's an important part of being able to enable the scheme to offer the best opportunities for participants in their recovery journey and in building their social and economic participation. We know, to put it frankly, that simply providing core supports is not going to be sufficient to helping people in their recovery journey. And that's why I think we're seeing this is one of a suite of initiatives. We are getting positive feedback, and as we'll go into, we are also getting feedback about how we can improve the way in which recovery coaches are structured. We're very open to those. It's early days. It's interesting. Today is really 3 months since the 1st of July, when the recovery coaches commenced. So it's early days, but we are seeing great interest in this concept. We are also conscious that it's going to take some time for both participants to understand it, for groups like you to understand it more, and then to integrate it in your work. And we see this as a concept that will evolve over time. So the first point I want to make is recovery coaching will be available to all participants with a primary psychosocial disability. And as you will be aware, support coordination is available to some participants, whereas this new support item is available to all participants. It's important to note that introducing this new support item, the NDIS is not taking anything away from participants. This is an additional item, but is only available for participants with primary psychosocial disability. Participants can choose to continue with a support coordinator level 2 or choose recovery coaching. So I'll now hand over to my colleague, Melitha Pereira.
Thanks, Jerry. I think Aranthy is actually going to talk about this bit. So Aranthy, over to you.
Thanks, Melitha. So what will a recovery coach do? As Jerry said, this is a specialist mental health support item. So it is very much a recovery-oriented, practice-based support item. So as you know, a fundamental aspect of recovery-oriented practice is building trusting and recovery-enabling relationships. So the first responsibility of any recovery coach is going to be to sit down with the participant, get to know them, really understand what their needs are, and come to that shared understanding of participants' wishes and needs. And another part of the recovery coach is to facilitate what we would call empowerment and decision-making capacity of a participant. I remember many years ago, I was sitting down with a group of consumers and excitedly talking about NDIS and saying how this is all about choice and control, and you'll get the money rather than a service provider. You get to decide how to spend the money. And one of the consumers just put their hand up and said, are they crazy? Why would they give me such a large amount of money? And for me, it was one of those moments where I thought, well, we've got a lot of work to do in terms of firstly building the confidence of participants to say, you are able to spend this money, it is yours, and also to make sure that they have the right support so that they can make the most of the funding that they receive. And the other part of the recovery coach is to really sit down with the participant and develop an individual recovery plan. So this is on top, in addition to the NDIS plan that a participant would have. And what's required by the individual recovery plan is to really dig deeper into the NDIS plan. As Jerry said, a lot of NDIS plans might have core supports funded in a plan. So, for example, a cleaning or cleaner, to do grocery shopping or to do some administrative work. But really to understand, what do these things mean in a participant's life? Remember, recovery-oriented practice means the starting point is that a participant is able to lead a life of their own choosing, and it's about building capacity of a person to be able to do these things. So it might be to say, right, you've got all this funding, core support funding. How can we make sure that you get the most of it so that you build the capacity to be able to do that yourself, and then maybe pursue your studies or do your social activities. And another important part of a recovery coach is then making sure that a person is connected to recovery-oriented services to help them achieve those goals identified in the individual recovery plan. And also to understand the other important people in a participant's life and understand the role that they play in a participant's life. And finally, a recovery coach will also understand the role of clinical services, if any, in a participant's life. So this is about understanding the episodic and fluctuating nature of mental health and how that plays out in a participant's life. The other exciting thing about this recovery coach support item is that within the recovery coach support item, participants have the choice of choosing a lived experience recovery coach, or what we would call a learned experience recovery coach. So what do we mean by a lived experience recovery coach? So it's about someone having an experience of mental ill health and recovery, but it's a lot more than just having that experience and the ability to disclose that to a participant. It's about a person being able to contextualize their experience within the wider system and to understand, to frame it within concepts like stigma and social isolation, and also to understand how those experiences fit within the broader context and how it could potentially and how it affects a participant's life. So again, I think it's really important to understand what it is that a lived experience recovery coach brings to the role and what we mean by a lived experience. Because a couple of weeks ago, Malitha and I had this interesting email from, I think, Plan in Cairns, where he said, I was explaining this to a client, and the client said, why would I want to choose another crazy person to be my lived experience recovery coach? So it's really important to be able to understand what it is that a lived experience recovery coach brings to the role, and to understand that it's a lot more than just that lived experience. It's about being able to draw on it as a knowledge base. I'm going to leave it there, Malitha.
Thanks, Arundhati. I'm just going to talk a little bit about the knowledge and skills that I expected of recovery coaches. And this is both recovery coaches with a primary lived experience, but also with a primary learnt experience. And these knowledge and skills are based on the existing national recovery-oriented practice framework. And for many people, I don't think any of this would be a surprise. So it's really about recovery coaches having knowledge and understanding of psychosocial disability, around recovery-oriented practice, around trauma-informed practice, and also how to support and include family as well. As Arundhati mentioned, it also includes knowing about clinical services, if that's relevant for someone, and how to navigate and collaborate with those services. And also having a good understanding of the episodic nature of mental health challenges as well. So we've articulated to do those tasks that Arundhati talked about. You need competencies like the ones that we've talked about. And then we've recommended that to demonstrate those competencies, a minimum requirement of training and experience. What we recommended is a Certificate 4 in mental health peer work for a lived experience recovery coach, or a Certificate 4 in mental health for a learned experience recovery coach, and a couple of years of mental health related work as well. But I think the important point here is that these competencies that we've described can be met with a number of different combinations of training and experience. So as Jerry said, we've been doing a lot of these presentations and talking to a lot of participants and their families and carers and also providers. And there's, I think, 3 pieces of themes of feedback that we're getting. Jerry, are you happy to talk about the workforce feedback that we're getting?
As I mentioned in the introduction, we've had very broad and diverse feedback supportive of the concept of recovery coach. But there's 3 themes that come through in the feedback, and they're probably some of the questions I guess you have today. The first is in regard to workforce. Will there be enough workers interested in taking up this role? And will they have the skills necessary to deliver the type of service that's there? Is the first theme. The second theme really is in relation to what's the difference between the role of the recovery coach and a support coordinator. And Melitha will go to this question in a moment. But this question of how do we understand what support coordination, what are the differences about what support coordination is from recovery coach? And I think one of the important points that I think Melitha will outline is support coordination was designed as an overall role, not a specific role for people with primary psychosocial disability. And the third issue that's been raised has been the pricing. And we'll try and address this. I think the point people have made, and it's reflected in some of the questions today, is why is the pricing different for a recovery coach to support coordination when there are some similarities in the roles? So, Melitha, over to you to look at providing answers to those themes.
Thank you, Jerry. And I think this is a very reasonable question that we get asked often. So, building on what Jerry said, the recovery coach is a tailored support for people with psychosocial disability support needs. And the key difference is that recovery coaches need to have and need to demonstrate those competencies. So they need to have knowledge and expertise around mental illness and psychosocial disability, understand personal recovery, and very important, understand the mental health service system as well, and the challenges people face navigating those systems. The other key difference is the funding criteria for support coordination and recovery coaching is very different. As many of you probably know, support coordination is not a funded support for all people with psychosocial disability. And for some people, when it is funded, the number of hours can be quite low as well because it has very different funding criteria. However, for to do some of the tasks and to work in a way that Arundhati talked about, so building a trusting relationship, getting to know someone, that takes time. So the number of hours and the funding levels for the recovery coach is very different. The other thing I do want to add is the pricing structure is a bit different as well. So the pricing for a recovery coach is dependent on the time of the day and day of the week. And recovery coaches can also claim activity-based transport, which support coordinators cannot. The other point I would like to make is that there is some work that's been done at the NDIA at the moment to better define support coordination. So many of you would know that discussion paper was released, and I think the submissions have closed. So depending on where that work lands, that will have a bit of an impact on the recovery coach role as well. Having said this, we have also heard that for some people, you know, they're working with a support coordinator and that's working really well. So it's really important that that relationship can be maintained for someone. So the way that recovery coaches are funded, it's a flexible support. It's not what we call a stated support, which means that if you have recovery coach funded in your plan, you can absolutely use that funding to maintain and continue your work with a support coordinator if you choose to do that. As Jerry said, actually before that, one thing to note is we're really talking about level 2 support coordination here. And that overlap from the feedback we've got is really around level 2 support coordination, whereas level 3 support coordination or specialist support coordination, that can be very much funded alongside recovery coaching. The other question we get often is around the pricing limits, and some of the feedback has been from some people that the price limit is too low for recovery coaching. So I just want to talk very quickly about how it was, how we went about the pricing. So it is reflected in the pricing advice that we got from the sector. So the recovery coach is at a SHADS award 4.4. And it is very much a distinct support, specially designed for psychosocial disability. And as I mentioned before, there are those two key different pricing structures in that the pricing is dependent on the time of the day and day of the week, and you can also claim activity-based transport for this support. Before we go to questions, just want to reiterate that it is a new support item, and it will take some time for it to be widely available. However, we will also be closely monitoring and considering feedback, including from sessions like this, and we will continue to refine this support item as we go along. And of course, there's a lot more information about this on the website as well. Thank you so much.
Great. Well, thank you to our three panelists. That was a really comprehensive coverage of the issues regarding recovery coaches. And I think you have touched on in those three themes of the feedback that you've already been getting, a lot of the substance of the questions that I can see coming through both through today and also the questions that were submitted when people registered. But nonetheless, we might still address some of these questions because there's some nuances, I think, in some of the questions asked that I know our participants would like to hear the views of the panelists. But can I thank all three of you again? I know you've been doing a lot of these presentations, so it's really great that we can have your time today. So the first question that was submitted by a participant at registration was, will customers be given information about the psychosocial recovery coach option at review?
I can have a go at that, and maybe around the end, Jerry would like to add. And so I think that's a great question, and I think this is one of the real positives of having a tailored support in the price guide for people with psychosocial disability, families and carers, because it's very difficult to have a review or a planning conversation without this support being discussed. So yes, absolutely. So at review and at plan, first plan meetings, for someone with psychosocial disability needs and their families, this support will be discussed and people will be given information. So we have provided some very clear guidance for LACs and planners, and we're actually in the process of training for LACs and planners on the recovery coach item. I think we're up to Victoria. We're kind of going around. We've done Western Australia, South Australia, New South Wales, and Queensland. Thank you for that question. And yes, absolutely. People will be given information about this during their review and at planning meetings.
Thanks, Melita. So the next question was, will the NDIA ensure that the psychosocial recovery coach will not be used to imply that a participant with psychosocial disabilities has recovered? In other words, making recommendations that the participant is sufficiently well enough to reduce supports?
I'll have a go at this one. The answer is this is not a central part of this role. The role of the recovery coach is very much to work with the person to help them articulate what's the level of support they need. Certainly that process at review, they would be one of a number of contributors, including the person themselves, to what was the level of resources that would be needed going forward. I think the question's a great question because it also opens up the issue of the purpose of recovery coach. And I think the concept of recovery coach, as is underlying by the concept of recovery, is how do we help people to take control of their lives and become as independent as they can be. And I think it's important to say part of the focus of this role is the skill, be it from a learnt or lived experience basis, in working with people to help them to achieve what they want to achieve in life. And that may also mean helping them to come to a point where they don't need as much support. And I think it's what we're wanting to do in the scheme is try to ensure that people get the right level of support at the right level of time.
Great. Thanks, Jerry. So the next question, can a recovery coach budget your supports and ensure funding will last a year, or does a participant need to do that because it's not support coordination?
Carmel, I'll take that. Remember, recovery coach will sit down with you and understand your needs and develop an individual recovery plan based on your NDIS plan. And that actually involves, once you've agreed on an individual recovery plan, to decide what supports do you need and how can you best use your NDIS package to make sure that you achieve those goals identified in your individual recovery plan. So yes, a recovery coach can support you to manage your budget so that the funding can last the year. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Arundathi. The next question is about children. Is a recovery coach available to support carers of children with mental health diagnoses?
Melita here, I'll try to answer that. If I understand the question correctly, so it's not a support specifically for carers, it's a support for people with psychosocial disability. So it's not a support designed for carers of people with psychosocial disability. It's more for people with a lived experience of psychosocial disability. So there are other supports for carers. One thing is around like the carer gateway, for example. So I think the answer to that question is no, not really. It's not a support for carers specifically.
And
thanks,
if I may add, Carmel,
yes,
if I may add to, but part of the recovery coach role is what we call family carer inclusive practice. So understanding the role of carers in a participant's life, and then saying maybe, referring the carers to appropriate services. Yeah.
Great. Thanks.
Yeah.
So the next question you really did address in some of the comments you made in your presentation, but it has been such a topical and live issue, and it's this question about support coordination and recovery coach and payment. So the question is, if being a recovery coach means the worker brings additional lived experience to the coordinator of support's role, then why is the recovery coach option paid less per hour than a regular coordinator of supports?
Yeah. So look, the distinction I want to draw here is that in terms of the lived experience thing, So there's the support coordinator role and there's the recovery coach role. And within the recovery coach role, you get these two streams. And both recovery coaches, all recovery coaches get paid the same amount. So there's no difference between what we would call a learned recovery coach and a lived experience recovery coach. So as a recovery coach, the lived experience recovery coach is not in any way devalued by the pricing set for the recovery coaches. I hope that explains it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's right, Arundhati. And look, as you know, it's been a live topic of discussion with regards to recovery coaches, and there's some comments made in the panel presentation about this as well, and I'm sure it's a discussion and debate that will continue on.
Carmel, can I make a couple of comments too on
Sure.
this? I think it's important to make the distinction, and that the point I think Melita was making, what we've tried to look at in pricing is what was a fair salary for this position. And the recommendation from the sector was essentially SHAD's 4.4, which is about $75,000. Now, this is a reasonably technical point, but the other points that I think have been put by the psychosocial disability sector was they also felt that the level of contribution towards management costs and particularly some of the costs in relation to supervision needed to be adjusted as well. And so what within the NDIS pricing model, particularly the percentages allocated to management cost is currently set at 10.5%. And the people who do the pricing, which is our pricing review unit, did consult and hear what were the arguments from the sector in relation to the cost pressures on service providers. The advice and the recommendation back from our pricing review unit was that the pressures on the psychosocial disability sector are similar to the rest of the disability sector, and they felt there were no specific issues. So I think this is an important issue. The margin for profit is set at 2% within our pricing model. I think one of the realities and one of the tensions, to be frank, is that people are making a much better margin out of support coordination than they are out of recovery coaching, and therefore they have been comfortable with wanting to continue that. To re-emphasise the point we might have said a bit subtly, but I'll say it bluntly if I might, that where people have either support coordination, where they have recovery coach in their plan, the participant can choose whether they continue to use those fundings for support coordination or recovery coach. That is a participant's choice, given the categorical way in which this has been funded. I think in practical terms, what that's meaning in relation to the sector is where people have support coordination in their plan, and that's working well for the participant, that is likely to continue. And I think as over time, as participants come to understand the value of this new support item, they will start to make more informed choices about how they want to use that, and how, if you like, they want to think about the balance between recovery coach and support coordination. So we can imagine a situation that someone might say, I want someone as a recovery coach to help me with a lot of my engagement, motivation, confidence issues, but I actually need probably 10 hours of support coordinator who knows about housing, because my recovery coach doesn't know about housing. So there's a bit of a mix and match concept here that I think it's important for you as practitioners in the field, if you're working with someone, to how you can support and advise someone of how they make the best value, how they get the best value out of the plan. Because the other important role we're seeing of a recovery coach is how also they work with the person, but with the family, with the clinical treating team, and others like, employment providers, housing providers. So there's a really important role for you as practitioners in helping participants who have the control of these packages to understand how they can get the best value by picking the range of supports that will meet their needs.
Thanks, Jerry. Thanks. That's some important points there, and I think that it is very much the case that these are early days as well in the life of this new support item, and it will take time, I think, for some of these things to settle and work themselves out. So the next question is, do you see this role as effectively a trained and qualified mental health support worker, similar to a FAMS worker, i.e. someone to walk beside the client to navigate safety, crisis and recovery?
Carmel, I'll take that one. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Yes. So as we said, this is a specialist psychosocial support. So a recovery coach has specialist mental health support training. So in that sense, yes, it is similar to a FAMS worker role. And as we said, it is very much recovery-oriented practice based. So that means building that trusting relationship with the person, understanding their needs, and walking beside them to navigate the NDIS system and the NDIS system as in the agency, and also the marketplace, as Jerry said, understanding all the services available and how to choose providers that best suit your needs, as well as understanding the role of clinical services in your life. So yes, in that sense, it is quite similar to a FAMS worker role. Yeah.
Thanks, Arundathi. The next question has come from a participant who has spoken about their son, who is 19 and has schizoaffective bipolar. He would like to move out of home within the next 12 months. He now leads a very isolated life. Is it possible to use a recovery coach with existing core funding, or do I need to request new funding?
Melissa here, I can try to answer that. Because the recovery coach funding has to be drawn from that appropriate capacity building category, unfortunately, you can't use your core funding to purchase recovery coaching at the moment. So you will require a plan review for that. But I do want to emphasize that there's a commitment by the NDIS for increased flexibility. So between core and capacity building. In fact, that was actually meant to happen quite sooner than, but it hasn't happened yet. But when that flexibility is introduced, there won't be core and capacity building categories, and you would be able to use purchased recovery coaching a lot more flexibly.
Thank you. Now, the next question is about employment opportunities. So is there a plan to create an NDIS psychosocial disability participant to NDIS recovery coach employment pathway? What kind of evidence report is required to have reasonable and necessary capacity building supports funded in a plan to achieve this goal? Now, that's a difficult one to answer, but I'm not sure if anyone can have a stab at it.
Yeah, I will, Carmel, and I was very excited to see that question because
it's an important one.
It's a very important one, and we would really like to see a lot of lived experience recovery coaches being available. And so currently, look, there is no plan specific for NDIS participants for becoming NDIS recovery coaches, but we would like to see that happening. And how that would happen is through your traditional ways of going to complete your Cert 4 in mental health or getting that work experience. So how can an NDIS plan support that is you would need the supports. It would be the same pathway that would use in achieving where you identified, employment as a goal and getting the appropriate supports to do that. Melissa, are you able to answer a bit more about that in terms of the actual NDIS support items that would help assist with employment?
Yeah, sure. But yeah, absolutely. And I just want to reiterate, like, I think, many people with participants with psychosocial disability and also carers as well are in a good place to be doing the support as they have had their own experience of navigating the NDIS and the other service systems as well. In terms of existing supports, I think it would be around supports around employment. So supports around finding and keeping a job, I think would be a good place to start in your current NDIS plan.
Carmel, can I just add a couple of comments on this? It is a great question, and it highlights some of the diversity of the skill sets that are required. When we were thinking about how we implement a recovery coach, one of the thinkings that we had is knowledge about recovery practice really rests in the psychosocial disability sector. And we, I suppose, would not have claimed that the NDIA was a major repository of psychosocial disability expertise. It sits with consumer, carer and service provider organisations. But what we are seeing that this question highlights is increasingly requests for us to start to develop guidance in relation to a range of implementation issues. And this is one of a number that are coming up. And for us, it's part of the thinking that we have is, how do we help evolve this role over time? We see, I suppose our vision for this is that everybody within the scheme with a primary psychosocial disability has a coach and has that opportunity to improve their lives through this support item. What I think we're coming to understand more and more is we are going to need to work with mental health consumers, mental health family and carers, and mental health service providers in developing more detailed guidance. The other element of this is the Disability Reform Council decisions that Carmel referred to in her introductory comments also said that this is the disability ministers across the country representing the Commonwealth and every state and territory said we need a new national statement, a new what they called a psychosocial disability framework to set out a national vision of where we should be going on psychosocial. Recently, the Commonwealth Government, in their response to the Tune Review, repeated the fact that they want this national statement and have put a time frame of the middle of next year on that. And I think this is a really important point. We have set up a stakeholder reference group with wide representation from across the country and across stakeholders to help us to define what this new national statement is, and also to work out how do we develop over time better practice guidance, better resources, better tools that people can use for participants, for service providers, to help people to use the available technology that is around. So this question, I suppose, I'm sorry, that's a slightly long-winded answer, Carmel, but I think it's just important to say recovery coaches are part of a range of strategies that we need to develop. There is no question at the moment that I think many people are a bit uncertain about exactly what this role will turn out to be. And in many ways, some of the answers lie with you in your role as advisors, as service providers, as consumers, as families and carer members. But for us, part of what we're trying to work towards is also over time to be developing new versions of guidance that bring together the best of experience, the best of practice wisdom. And particularly as we go into a funding stream where the NDIS will be delivering greater flexibility, we think it's even more important that participants have access to good information through a range of mediums and help them work out what are the strategies that seem to work in people's lives? How do they choose the right strategy for them in their life and in their circumstances? So that's part of, I suppose, the broader context and strategy that we're committed to working with people across the sector and trying to build over the next few years.
Thanks, Jerry, and Arundathi and Melitha, who all had something to contribute, but that was a very important question. And in fact, I'm now turning to the questions that have been coming through as participants have been listening to the webinar. And there's a number of questions from people asking about how to become a recovery coach, what qualification is the best, are there mature age scholarships? So I think you've probably answered that in terms of saying that the qualification is the certificate for mental health or certificate for mental health peer work. I'll just check, is there anything further you wished to add to that? Melitha, I think you said that in your comments.
Yes, I think the only thing I would add to that is what we have recommended as a way of meeting those competencies. But I really want to stress that there are a number of ways you can meet those competencies through lots of different experiences and different qualifications. So just to keep that in mind.
Great, thanks, Melitha. I think you have covered this, but it still keeps coming through the feed, so I might just get you to clarify. The question is, just to clarify, you can't have both a support coordinator and a recovery coach. So can you just outline the circumstances where, I think Jerry said at a level 3 you could, but anyway, if you could make that clear for people.
Melitha, do you want to have a go at that one?
Yeah, sure. This is a very reasonable question. There is the point I would make is around is what is funded as reasonable and necessary in your plan, and the choice and the control that you have on how you spend those funding. So generally speaking, and again, this is at a very high, I guess, policy level, but delegates and planners and LACs, have to make individual decisions based on your individual circumstances. But for most people, what will be funded is either a level 2 recovery coach or a level 2 support coordinator or a recovery coach. But when a recovery coach is funded, that funding can be used flexibly to either purchase a support coordinator or a recovery coach or both. So that's the distinction that I really want to make. So there's what might be funded in your plan, which might be a recovery coach. However, that funding, how you choose to spend that funding is up to you. You can use it to continue with a support coordinator level 2, or you can continue to, if you want to, you can purchase a recovery coach. And if you choose to, you can have both as well. So I think that's what's a bit confusing about this. So generally, it's either recovery coach or support coordination, but it is important that there might be some, really important to mention that there might be some situations, like Jerry mentioned, where there might be some specific housing needs or a specific piece of work that needs to be done, where a support coordinator and a recovery coach can be funded. So that is a little bit confusing, I appreciate. It is case by case. And our hope is that through the upskilling and the training that we're doing, that LACs and planners will be able to explain this and talk through these options with you so you can make an informed choice.
Great, thank you. And we're really getting our money's worth out of our panel. So thank you very much. We've got a lot of questions still coming through, and we've got about 5 more minutes. So if you can bear with me, there's a number of questions asking if the presentation will be available after the webinar, and yes, it will be. You'll be able to access the webinar. So there's a question about what is the recovery model being used by recovery coaches. I'm not sure that you can really provide more information, but I might just check with the panel. Is there anything further you would want to say about that?
The comment I would make to that is what we're very conscious that there are a diversity of models and service models that are used. We've done some recent work as part of the development of this draft national framework. And that's highlighted that we have, just in terms of state and territory governments, 8 different documents, all of which have particular approaches. We do have other Commonwealth departments and ourselves with particular elements of what recovery coaches mean. In many ways, there are lots of common themes across all these documents. But one of the reasons why we felt in thinking forward about recovery, why a new contemporary national framework was needed, was to try and move towards some consensus about what were the broad elements of what was trying to be achieved. We understand there are national guidance to clinical mental health services through the 2014 recovery practice document issued out through the Department of Health in 2014. What we've felt was needed, and I think what many people are agreeing with, is we need a more contemporary statement of what recovery means in Australia in 2020 and for the next decade. So that is a process that we will be running national consultations on in the first half of next year, and we'll be looking to the release of a national statement to provide greater consistency and national guidance in relation to goals for recovery.
Thanks, Jerry. Now, there's a couple of questions about whether recovery coaches are available to people under the age of 18. So plan participants, I take it, for participants. Can younger participants access this?
The recovery coach is accessible to anybody who has a primary psychosocial disability classification. So there's no age criteria in regards to that. Clearly, the majority of participants in the scheme with a primary psychosocial disability are over 20 years of age, but there is nothing stopping someone younger. One of the pieces of feedback we've had within the agency and outside the agency, great concept, why isn't it available particularly for people who have a secondary psychosocial disability? So particularly people, say, with an intellectual disability and mental health issues. And the answer to that is we're responding to the needs for a particular group, and the broader extension of this will need to be considered over time.
Great. Thanks, Jerry. So we might have time for just one more question. Still seems we might try and get some clarity around that issue that Malitha spoke to with regards to recovery coaches and support coordination. There still seems to be some confusion about that.
So maybe what
do recovery coaches need to report on to the NDIS about the participant?
I can answer that, but Jerry, did you want to say something a little bit more about the support coordinator?
No, you go ahead and answer that one. That's fine.
Sure. So the reporting requirements will be set by the planner, and they're very similar to some of the requirements for support coordination at the moment. But one of the key differences in the guidance that we've provided is, as much as possible, the reporting should be co-authored by the participant and their families and the recovery coach. But on the top of my head, I think the first report is like 8 weeks after first engagement, and then another one before review. But the planner will specify the type of reporting and the frequency of reporting.
Great, thanks, Melissa. Well, look, I think that's all we have time for today. There are still some subsequent questions, and we'll try and get back to those through communication with people who have registered. There's also the question, as I said, about will the recording be available? And yes, it will, and it will be automatically emailed to anyone who registered for the webinar, so people will be able to access the recording and go back through the issues that have been raised. I do want to thank our panel participants once again, Melissa, Arundathi and Jerry. You've really been very generous with your time. You've provided a lot of detail and information. I think you can see from both the number of participants and also the questions that are being asked that there is enormous interest in this issue. And I think people very much will welcome your comments, Jerry, that there's an ongoing opportunity for discussion, particularly around the framework that sits around these initiatives. I think that's something that there's going to be a great deal of interest in participating in that process. I would just also like to mention a number of people have raised how it's possible to access the training for recovery coaches. The Mental Health Coordinating Council, who's hosting today's webinar, we're a registered training organisation, and we provide both the certificate for mental health peer work and certificate for mental health, and you can find details about that on our website. There are other providers of this training as well, but there is more information about that on our website. So in closing, I would like to thank the participants. I'd like to thank the NDIA. This webinar is one of a series of 5 webinars. This is the first that we will be holding as part of a project that we've been funded for by the NDIA through a national ILC grant. So keep an eye out for the next 4 webinars. They will be taking place over the rest of this year and early next year. And I want to thank everyone for participating. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Thanks.